And welcome back to the Wellness Paradox podcast. I'm so grateful that you joined us on this journey towards greater human flourishing. As always, I'm your host, Michael Stack, an exercise physiologist by training and a health entrepreneur and a health educator by trade. And I'm fascinated by a phenomena that I call the wellness paradox. This paradox, as I view it, is the interaction and communication gap that exists between our medical professionals and our fitness and wellness professionals. And this podcast is all about closing off that gap by disseminating the latest, most evidence-based, and most engaging information in the health sciences. And to do that in episode 30, hard to believe we're on episode 30, we're joined by Dr. Joseph Muñoz of Team Biolayne. Some of you may know the name Layne Norton. He's a very prominent figure in our world. Dr. Muñoz is a PhD in nutrition, who's also a coach for Team Biolayne. And this podcast, we're going to talk about the importance of maintaining, if not gaining, muscle mass as we age, not only as a predictor of longevity, but also as a predictor of vitality and functional capacity. Indeed, there is a difference between how long you live and how well you live. And this podcast is going to dive into a bunch of very nuanced concepts on resistance training. For those of you that don't have a strong background with resistance training, this podcast actually may provide you a little bit of a motivation to learn more about all the training parameters that have manipulated in a valid resistance training program for anyone at any age, but certainly for our aging population. We will link up to a number of different resources on the show notes page. That can be found by going to wellnessparadoxpod.com, episode 30. Please enjoy this conversation with Dr. Joseph Muñoz. They were delighted to be joined by Dr. Joseph Muñoz. Dr. Muñoz is the last time I'm going to call you that during this. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
This is going to be a neat discussion because it's a resistance training discussion. And you know, before we got on air, we were talking about evidence-based resistance training and how it's cool that you work with people that are in their 40s and 50s that are really into this. And that's what our discussion is going to be around today. But to tee that up, why don't you just give everyone a little bit of an idea of your background that you're bringing to this conversation?
Sure. So first off, thank you for introducing me. As you mentioned, you didn't mention, I recently graduated with my PhD. I actually finished with my PhD from Florida State University last December. So fairly recent grad. I'm only 27, so I guess pretty young for a doctor. But I did my undergraduate and graduate degrees at Florida State University, started college in 2012. And originally my interest was definitely not too much in the field of nutrition or exercise science at all. I was actually originally trying to be a music major. And after having like a deep heart-to-heart conversation with my mom, she convinced me not to do it because she thought I was going to be broke the rest of my life. And fair assumption, I guess, right?
Yeah.
And so, I was really thinking, what else do I enjoy? And I've always been I've always played sports competitively since I was a kid. That was kind of a requirement my mom always had for me, was school, some sort of extracurricular activity that's like mentally challenging. And then that was typically music for me. And then an extracurricular activity that was exercise related. And so I played basketball. I played pretty much every sport, wasn't too good at any of them. And then in high school, got into lifting. And so, after discussing the whole music thing, I decided to take some basic biology classes. Still wasn't even like in the nutrition major. And then I just started realizing I really enjoyed it, really enjoyed learning about the science, which was interesting because applied sciences were never really my strong suit in high school. But once I started learning material that I enjoyed, I started liking it more. I decided to do a nutrition major. And then after finishing undergrad, I was like, well, I can't really get a job with an undergrad in nutrition. So let's go to grad school. I enjoyed school and I didn't mind going for a master's degree. And then in the midst of being in my master's, I didn't really know how the whole process of research really happened, or didn't really have a good grasp of what research is in the first place. feel like a lot of people who start off their master's perhaps find themselves in a similar spot. And the professor that I was working with, who was my major professor, um, his philosophy is to get students involved in research as soon as absolutely possible.
Mhm.
So day one, I was involved in research. Started in the lab working on a hamster study. We were actually trying to investigate the effects of black bean consumption on atherosclerosis formation. So cool study there. Short recap, there's pretty good evidence to show that legumes in general are good for cardiovascular health. But I got involved in research there, really enjoyed it. But for my master's degree, I had to take out a good amount of student loans, which I wasn't okay with. And my professor was like, well, if you do a PhD, we can pay you a stipend. So would you like to stay here for a PhD? And that was kind of my intro into starting a PhD. Didn't really even think about it too much. I was like, well, this can pay me and I don't have to pay for school, so I'm going to go ahead and go this route. And for my PhD, I studied the effects of dried plums on bone health in older men. I know we're going to talk about resistance training in older populations here in a little bit, but there's really good evidence that nutrition is equally important. And in general, the consensus was, well, to give you a little bit of a backstory, my professor did previous research in postmenopausal women, seeing if dried plums can help with bone health. Right? Women after menopause tend to lose a significant amount of bone density at a much faster rate than men do. And there are compounds in prunes that have estrogen-like properties. There's also boron in prunes, which is important for bone health. And this clinical study showed that dried plums don't necessarily reverse bone loss, but they attenuate further bone loss. So that was shown in women. So we were doing the same study in men. That was part of my dissertation work. And then after graduating, I always knew I wanted to do a little bit more work in exercise science specifically. Specifically, actually, sports nutrition, which is what I've always really enjoyed, like seeing how nutrition can improve performance, essentially. There's a professor at FSU, his name is Michael Ormsby, did a short postdoc with him. Honestly, it was like right when COVID was in full effect, and it was kind of hard to do research, but I had a really good experience there. He does a lot of research on pre-bedtime nutrition and how that can affect variables like your metabolic rate, fat oxidation, performance, hunger, and satiety. So really got a lot of cool research in that lab. And then once I graduated, I've never really been, my focus was never really to be an academic per se. So I didn't pursue a career in academia. Well, as of so far, I haven't, and I guess I only really graduated a little over, well, I guess a whole year now. But I've been working with Layne as part of Team Biolayne, doing coaching, working with a lot of general public people. We were talking about that before we got started. And before starting graduate school, I was doing personal training, and I really missed that connection of working with people. And with my knowledge now, and I think really what graduate school teaches you is how to think critically. I think those skills translate really well to working with one-on-one clients now, and perhaps a little bit more of a mature clientele, we can say, than the people I used to work with when I was back in college. Yeah.
I love it. It's a great story. I didn't anticipate it starting out with music, but I think I see an instrument in the background. Possibly.
Yeah, I have my guitar and my saxophone in the background.
I love it. I love it. And you mentioned Layne, and in reference to Layne Norton, and you're a coach for Team Biolayne. I guess just really quickly touch on a little bit of Team Biolayne, and maybe just expand on a little bit more of what you do there.
Sure. So for those of you that may or may not know, Dr. Layne Norton, he's a very well-known person in the field of nutrition and exercise science. He has competed at a very high level in both bodybuilding and powerlifting, but he also has very high academic endeavors, right? He's gotten his doctorate degree in nutrition, but his particular field of research was protein metabolism. And similar to myself, he did not pursue an academic career. And he actually started his coaching business when he was still in graduate school. And by the time he finished, he had built up a good enough clientele to where he could sustain his lifestyle full time, just coaching, right? So that was the route he went. He is really good at what he does. I don't really say that because I work with him, but he really is good at what he does, and he's very knowledgeable. And for that reason, his coaching business grew pretty quick. He couldn't handle all the clients, so he started a coaching team. I reached out to, I've actually been doing some work with him for several years. I used to write for him previously for his website. And then towards the end of my PhD, I expressed wanting to potentially have a full-time opportunity working with him. And there was an opportunity with coaching. So I went ahead and joined his coaching team. And essentially what we do is we try to provide the best evidence-based nutrition and training coaching available. We, at least myself, I do pride myself in staying on top of literature, really know what's supported by the evidence and what's not, right? And we try to bring that practice and really integrate it into our coaching. Yeah, and that's pretty much what we do. Our mission statement really is to just provide the best evidence-based coaching that we can.
Yeah, and I've read a lot of Layne's stuff, listened to a lot of his videos. He's incredibly knowledgeable, and not surprised his coaching practice grew like that. What I was surprised about was something that you told me about before we came on the air, which is that 20% of your clients are the physique type athletes that I would think would be working with someone on Layne's coaching team. And the other 80% are adult general population clients, which is, I think, is a really cool segue to our conversation here about the importance of maintaining muscle mass with age. And the way I connected with you was through a post on Instagram on something related to hypertrophy, and it just got my wheels turning. And I'm a meathead myself. So like, well, if there's a way for us to talk about hypertrophy, but how it benefits health and vitality as we age, it's a great topic. So let's get into this just on a very basic level. Why is this such an important topic for fitness professionals to consider with our aging population, the at least the maintenance, if not the growth of muscle tissue with age?
It's important to consider fitness, particularly when we're aging. And I was discussing the fact that there's many predictors of longevity, but also quality of life as we age. And a lot of those predictors are fitness related predictors, such as total muscle mass, right? Significantly associated with longevity, not only longevity, but quality of life. Grip strength, surprisingly, is one of the biggest predictors, not only of longevity, but of all-cause mortality, which is really interesting. I was listening to a podcast this morning. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Dr. Peter Attia, but he was discussing, he's a cardiologist, I believe. I could be wrong there, don't quote me, but he was just discussing the role of grip strength for longevity and all-cause mortality. And it really is one of the strongest predictors of those variables, which is incredible, right? Something so simple as grip strength. But if you really think about it, in general, if you resistance train, if you are improving your strength in your upper body, even in your lower body, if you're holding something in your hands, it's pretty much an indirect predictor of total body strength, right? Mm-hmm. But not only those, it's important to consider fitness as we age, not only because it is a strong predictor of longevity and quality of life, but also because a lot of these variables associated with fitness decrease at an exponential rate when we age, right? Mm-hmm. For example, one really important variable that perhaps we don't consider so much as a benefit of resistance training is bone health. As I told you, during my PhD, we studied nutrition and bone health. But aside from nutrition, resistance training is the number one thing you can really do to improve your bone health, right? And really at a certain age, all you can really do is mitigate bone loss with resistance training. Bone loss is going to occur regardless. And I think it's after age 70, the greatest cause of accidental death, which previous to age 70 would be something like a car accident, right? At older ages, it's just falls, right? You fall, you break a hip and you can't get up. And I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 to like 80% of older adults who experience a fracture die within a year of the fracture, which really is very sad, but it's also alarming because you and I were young. We were young guys, we lift weights. We don't really think about falling and breaking a bone, right? Yet it's one of the main causes of death at old ages. And again, the only thing you can really do to mitigate that is resistance training. So there's really, a number of reasons why we should be talking about resistance training as you age. And as we were talking a little bit earlier, I really do think it's the general population is changing in terms of how much knowledge they do have about resistance training and knowing the importance of resistance training, right? Because like I told you, a lot of the clients I work with are middle-aged adults, and the reason they resistance train is not to look incredible, although they do obviously want to look incredible, but they see so many health-related benefits, just energy throughout the day. They feel great, a better relationship with their loved ones, right? It's also an incredible emotional, it incredibly benefits you emotionally as well, right? Mood, behavior, these are all factors that are associated with improved physical health. So it's not just the physical component of it, but also the mental component of exercise is incredibly important as we age too.
Yeah, I love it. And I'm so glad you brought up the grip strength study, because those have been some of the largest scale epidemiological studies that have shown the importance of this, and more so from a risk ratio standpoint than even things like, blood pressure and blood lipids. It's like consistently one of the biggest markers. And I start to think in my mind, like, strength training is the new cardio from a longevity perspective, because for years, and with all deference to Kenneth Cooper in the Cooper Clinic and what he did for aerobics, now we're starting to realize that there's a bunch of benefits to resistance training that not only affect your length of life, your longevity, which I think you were right to mention that, but really the quality of your life as you age, and I think that that's critical. And our population's getting older, right?
Yeah, that's a huge factor, right? Average life expectancy continually increases. So if we're going to have an older population, it's important to have a healthy population as well.
Yeah. And they also happen to be the population that has the disposable income, to your point earlier, to actually spend on coaching services. When you're 22, 23, 24, I mean, you just live this as the poor graduate student. You don't have that kind of money. But when you get into your 50s and 60s, you actually have the disposable income to be able to engage in something like this. So I think on so many levels, it's important. And let's talk about some of the differences, though, because certainly training an older person is just not like training a younger person, but just like a little bit slower. Like, there are considerations that you have to take into play here. And we can make this really practical. You work with young clients, you work with old clients. So what's your mental model like when you think, hey, I'm working with a 55 or a 60-year-old versus a 20-year-old with regard to strength training?
Yeah, well, I think the main thing to mention there is that you are correct. There's differences between working with somebody who's young and somebody who's older. But I have seen instances where I've been working with an old adult who has similar capabilities to somebody who's young, because they've been resistance training or exercising consistently their whole life, right? So although there are differences, you can certainly, I guess the term would be, age gracefully, right?
Yes, yeah.
Where if you take care of yourself and exercise throughout your life, you can really, maybe be 60 or 70 in terms of your age, but feel like you're half that,
Yep.
Especially if you focus on both nutrition and exercise, but then other factors like stress and sleep, which are incredibly important too, right? But no, some of the really important considerations that I take into account when working with somebody who's starting resistance training, let's say they're 20 versus somebody who's starting and they're 50 or 60. One really big factor is the ability to recover from resistance training. I'd say that's probably one of the largest differences. I remember even myself personally, I'm not that old, right? I'm 27. But when I was 18, I would lift maybe an hour and a half a day. Also keep in mind, I didn't know what I was doing, so the technique wasn't great. And I would play basketball 2 to 3 hours a day. I'm not exaggerating. Basketball and lifting weights was what I did every day. And I felt fine. 100% fine in terms of recovery, never had any joint pain. And now I don't play basketball at all because it really hurts my knees, unfortunately. So I focus pretty much solely on resistance training nowadays. But the recoverability is huge, right? So I set different standards in terms of what I think is achievable in terms of rate of progress. A younger individual will typically progress a lot quicker. So for those of you that are listening that are maybe newer to resistance training, the goal when you're lifting weights is not to go as hard as you possibly can today, but it's to have a sustainable program that will allow you to be better a month from now compared to today, right? Like if you compare yourself over time, you always want to be a little bit stronger. And to do so does not require you going as hard as you can every single time, at least, right? There will be periods of time where you push hard in terms of resistance training. But that progress on a weekly basis or on a monthly basis is skewed significantly, I'd say, depending on your age, where somebody who's 20 can perhaps add 5 to 10 pounds on certain exercises on a weekly basis for like almost a whole year. It's incredible, right? And then when you're 70 or even younger than that, let's say 50 and above, that rate of progress may be a lot slower, right? And it's not just, I mean, age is obviously the factor, but you also have to take into account that somebody who's 20 is probably still developing, right? Still putting on muscle mass rapidly, even if they weren't resistance training as hard, right? Because they're still developing, still maturing. But I think that's one big factor, right? So recoverability is huge. Another one is typically older adults tend to have more joint pain, right? So at least when I start working with an older population, I obviously really emphasize technique in all populations, but I really emphasize it in older populations to where I won't necessarily want them to push themselves a little bit harder if there are small things technique-wise that can be improved, right? And technique is a little bit arbitrary because we have, like, for a squat, we have the idea of a picture-perfect squat, but there really is a lot of variation based off your anatomy, right? Whereas a younger population, perhaps, like, if it's not perfect, but it's good enough, they want to push a little bit harder. I'm like, hey, man, like sometimes they want to push a little bit harder. They feel motivated. And I know that will continue to improve over time. I'm okay with maybe smaller mistakes being acceptable in a younger population. So something that joint pain also brings is limited range of motion, right? And that's one thing I always work on with older populations before really pushing weight is improving range of motion. Because surprisingly, you can really improve range of motion over time, even if you're older, right? A lot of people, particularly at older ages, perhaps feel like, bending down and picking up something from the floor without bending your knees is something they were able to do when they're young, but there's no way they could do it now. And it really is like the phrase, if you don't use it, you lose it. It's so true, right? But also, if you reintroduce the action, you will improve it over time, right? And it's the whole idea of hormesis, which is if you present the body with a small stress, that's not a significant stress, you can learn to overcome that stress, right? So the stress in this situation can be pushing your range of motion a little bit beyond your comfort zone, right? So let's say you bend to 45 degrees and that's as far as you can go pain-free. Then maybe we bend to like 48 to 50 degrees where there's a little bit of discomfort. And we'll do that 15 to 20 times, right? It sounds super boring at a slow pace. But you do that 2 or 3 weeks in a row, and now the 50 degrees doesn't hurt anymore. So now you can go to 55 degrees. And over time, you can touch the floor without pain. I actually want to share the story of a client I used to work with. This was when I was personal training, probably about 5 years ago. I was working with an older woman. She was probably in her 70s. And she had really bad knee osteoarthritis. Essentially, she had no cartilage and bone-on-bone rubbing of the knee. And she was in pain. She needed assistance to be able to sit down. Again, at that time, I was also a lot more naive in terms of my knowledge, but my idea was the same as what I just mentioned. Well, we'll do a little bit more beyond your comfort zone. And I am not kidding you. I worked with her for a year. To sit to 90 degrees, she would when people like bend down 45 degrees and then plop because they don't have the strength. Yep. So we started just working on sitting to 90 degrees with control. After working with her for a year, she was doing full range of motion goblet squats with like a 20-pound dumbbell. Now, this is, for us, we hear that and it sounds incredible, right? And it is incredible, the fact that she was able to accomplish that. but that's one of the main differences between an older adult and a young adult, right? I said it took a year to be able to do 20 pounds, where the young guy would be doing that straight off the bat, day one.
Right.
So I really do think those are some of the major differences. One, recoverability. So with recoverability, that'll also influence how much total weekly load they do. Although I really do think the body's highly adaptable, and I would say an old adult with a good amount of training experience can probably handle very similar volumes to a young adult, if they've been doing that high volume for some time. The other aspect would be really honing technique in older adults, joint pain, how to deal with that. That story that I shared with you, I think, is a really, really cool story, because it shows how your body does adapt to stress, right? And you can go from having some joint pain to really improving that with improving range of motion and doing things correctly. You can improve your joint pain. Perhaps some individuals don't, because again, they might push themselves a little too hard, right? Not emphasize technique, do things a little bit inappropriately, which may exacerbate the pain. But if done correctly, you can certainly improve pain. And then a third aspect that I think is a really big difference that I didn't mention is mindset. The way an older person approaches resistance training, or the goals that they have around resistance training, are very different than that of like a 20-year-old person, right? Most 20-year-olds that lift weights, I'd say probably all 20-year-olds, just want to look good. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? I started in this field because I just wanted to look good. My mom and my dad were into exercise and they looked good, and I was like, I want to look good. So what first starts as an extrinsic motivator definitely over time becomes an intrinsic motivator. And that's the major difference. I think young people are really extrinsically motivated. Again, there's nothing wrong with that. And then older adults are more intrinsically motivated, where the motivation comes within, right? It's them achieving something for themselves, not so much like seeking validation from others. So wanting to improve their health, right? Wanting to low blood pressure, better glucose control for diabetics potentially, things that are going to improve their health. And that's certainly one big distinction I've always noticed when I work with older adults. And I actually enjoy working with older adults more because of that. Because young people are impatient with results. I'm sure you know that. I mean, I'm impatient with results with myself. So yeah, but I'd say those are probably the three biggest differences between young and old adults.
Yeah, that's great, man. A lot of golden nuggets in there to mine. The first one that I want to mention that you said, and you said it right off the bat, is the difference between somebody's chronological age and their physiological or their training age. I see 70-year-olds all the time in my gym that look like 50-year-olds, and I see 50-year-olds out in the street that look like they're 80 years old. And you can't be looking at their date of birth to determine their starting point and their progression. It really has to be what their actual training status is. And I think that's key. And I want to talk about the progression thing in a second, because it actually leads into a question that I'm really keen to ask you. But I do want to go back to what you talked about in terms of the ability to recover, because I think we would all agree that just through our own anecdotal observations, like you said, I think back to my workouts when I was 18 years old. I do 30 sets of chest on a Monday, and then I go back on Wednesday and do another 30 sets of chest and be fine. If I did 30 sets of chest on a Monday now, 4 weeks later, I wouldn't be doing chest. But what are you using as markers of recovery? I assume, and subjectively in a lot of cases, in your older clients that you work with, how are you determining how well they're recovering? And then, from there, how that informs progression?
Yeah, so I would say there's some objective and mainly subjective measures that I use. I guess I'll touch on the objective measure first, because there's really only one, and that's, for me, their performance, right? Because at the end of the day, let's say a lot of the subjective measures maybe not looking the best in terms of recovery, but if they're progressing on a weekly basis, then that probably tells me that the subjective measures are being influenced by something outside of the resistance training, right? Maybe life stress is something else, who knows? And I'll say what the subjective measures are in a second. But really, objectively, I look at their training plan. I see, are you making progress? If you are making progress, it's likely that the volume is appropriate. And then I won't be alarmed if there's like 1 week where there's bad performance, because that's very normal, right? We all experience bad weeks, and that can be influenced just like by life events, stress, work, whatever, right? Let's say you usually work out at 3 p.m. and you had to work late today and you go at 7 p.m. It's likely that your performance won't be all that good. But let's say everything's been pretty normal and their performance this week dips a little bit. I'll usually have a conversation with them, be like, hey, what do you think is going on this week? Why was your performance a little bit down? Oh, I don't know, just felt off in the gym, was a little bit tired. Okay, no big deal. 1 week's not alarming, but if I see probably 2 or 3 weeks in a row where the person is not performing as well as they have in the past, right? It's not even about improving performance. Is like their workout now, objectively, just looking at numbers on a piece of paper, is it worse than it was, let's say, 4 weeks ago? That's a good measure that perhaps the volume's a little bit too much, right? And in that circumstance, I usually give them a little bit of a deload week, right? And I'm not sure how experienced your listeners are with that type of terminology, but a deload week is just a week where you train a lot easier, right? So you reduce the weight, you reduce the number of sets you do, you reduce the number of repetitions significantly, usually by 40 to 50%, just to like still get some movement, still practice the exercise, because that's another thing, like doing an exercise correctly, there's an element of practice to it, where if you don't practice it, it feels awkward when you do it again. Yep. Even if you're still strong, right? So that week allows you to reduce fatigue, reduce stress, allow your body to recover, and then you can usually come into training pretty well the week after, right? Honestly, I can't think of any circumstance where like we had a nice deload week and the person comes back and like the performance is still bad. It usually just doesn't happen if their other aspects of life are in check, right? Nutrition, sleep, stress, all that stuff. So that is objective. And another thing I consider there too is I usually like giving people, I'm sure you know what the term a mesocycle is, but essentially like a block of training, right? And usually when you start a block of training, it starts off relatively easy and it gets pretty hard over that block. So I like to really do a block of like 4 to 6 weeks. I think it's appropriate length to really accumulate some volume over that time. And usually all of my clients, or the majority of my clients, will have a hard time recovering on week 6 because the volume's pretty high, right? It's intentional. So the next week is purposefully going to be a little bit of a deload so they can recover. So that's really the objective measure. On the subjective side of things, I like to look at how's your sleep, right? Sleep can significantly be affected by overtraining or poor recoverability, right? It can be like difficulties sleeping, right? Some people will experience difficulties being able to sleep, waking up through the night, just having poor sleep quality if they are handling maybe too much volume in training and they are overtraining. On the other hand, there's also the aspect of I'm still sleeping all night long, but I am exhausted, right? That's a big one. Like, you're not really stressed out at work, nothing in your personal life stressing you, you're getting adequate sleep, but you're just dragging your feet. That's really probably one of the biggest subjective factors, I'd say. And then other things that I like to ask about, but I don't necessarily put such a big value on, is like general mood, general feelings, also like hunger and satiety can be influenced, general stress, like if they're more like reactive to situations that they potentially wouldn't be so reactive to. Those are really the subjective measures I look at. But like I said, I think really the most important one is like, are you not stressed and are you sleeping? Are you still dragging your feet all day? That's really a big one for me.
Yeah, I love it. And I think it's so important that it is the intersection of those objective and those subjective measures. Just to follow up to make sure we tie a bow on it. When you talk about performance, performance to me, and I want to check in with you on what you mean by that, that could mean that I'm hitting my rep numbers at the same loads as previous weeks, or I'm able to progress in load. What are you using to determine performance maintenance or improvement?
Yeah, so mainly weight and repetitions on exercises, right? And sometimes it's a little bit more discrete than that. Like let's say I usually prescribe like 4 sets for somebody to perform on a certain exercise, let's say a squat. And let's say last week they were able to do 4 sets of 8 on that exercise. And this week they were able to hit the first 2 sets of 8, but then like they were barely able to hit like 5 or 4.
Mhm.
And usually when something like that happens, I'm like, hey, what's going on? What happened? And they'll say something like, I don't know, I felt fine, but like out of nowhere, I just like hit a wall and just was exhausted. And that sometimes happens where like you'll see when people are handling too much volume, like they come into gym, they're okay, they can do fine on that first exercise, and then performance just tanks on the subsequent exercises, right? But really what I look at is, let's say on a particular exercise, I look at their volume. So I'll take like the weight they use, multiply it by the reps to get like a total tonnage. And maybe in those 4 sets, they just like haven't been able to get as much volume as they have previously. That's one good measure. If they're using the same weight but doing less reps, that's a good measure. Or if they're doing the same reps but can't do the weight that I asked them to do when they have in the past, that's a good measure.
Yeah, great. Yeah, and again, these are very simple, objective things that you can utilize, particularly when you're doing remote coaching, when you're actually not physically in the gym with them, which I think there's a lot of people in our post-COVID industry that they're doing those. And I have a lot of questions around progression that will kind of lead us into this next question. And you've kind of already answered it, but I think it's important that we address it directly. It's that the overall conservative nature that we tend to train people with as they age. And this is, I'm making a very broad statement here. Certainly, I think you and a lot of our listeners, they aren't afraid to push an older population at an appropriate level. But talk on that for a second, this general conservative nature. And I don't mean to like throw chair exercise with 3-pound dumbbells under the bus here, but like we seem to be discounting something you said earlier, which is the ability for the human body to adapt at any age. Yeah.
So I'm assuming you're referring to like people not working out hard or wanting to work out hard at older ages, right? Because of like
more
being
so
afraid of
the
injuries.
fear.
Like that.
Yes.
The
fear. Yes.
Yes. Yeah. So I guess to touch on the evidence side of things a little bit, there are so many studies showing that heavy resistance training is extremely safe for all sorts of older populations. And when I say all sorts of older populations, I mean older populations with different conditions. So osteoarthritis, diabetes, right? Cardiovascular conditions. There are ample studies showing that they are not only efficacious, means it works, but they are extremely safe. Right? Actually, I made a post on this not too long ago. Lifting weights is one of the safest type of exercises you can do. If you look at injury rates from any competitive sports, and of course, I'm not talking about like having older adults play extremely competitive football or anything like that, but even just running, like injury rates are greater than when it comes to resistance training. That's usually too because not everybody who resistance train is doing like heavy compound movements with free weights. If you're doing machines and stuff like that, it's probably not as beneficial as doing some exercises with free weights, but they're still beneficial for gaining muscle mass. And those are incredibly safe, right? Because they determine the range of motion for you. And if you control the weight, really the risk of injury is minimal. So to kind of summarize the answer to that question, it is common, right? Older adults are scared of injury. But what they don't realize is that resistance training will prevent injury, right? Like we talked about earlier, improved muscle mass, improved bone health on their own are variables that are going to reduce risk of injury overall. And the only way to really improve those is through doing progressive resistance training. And there's nothing wrong with starting on squats, like sitting in a chair with a 3-pound dumbbell, if that is difficult for you, right? But the general consensus is if you want to grow muscle, you have to challenge the muscle. Theoretically, you have to take the muscle near momentary muscular failure. And that means if you were to try to do another repetition with good technique, you probably wouldn't be able to do so, or you're not so confident that you would be able to do so. And that doesn't have to be done with extremely heavy weight, because there's also evidence that taking a set near 30 repetitions is effective. And to do a set with 30 repetitions, you don't need that heavy of weight, right? I'd say let's say some older adults who may be overweight and are starting to do things like squats, probably just bodyweight squats is going to be pretty challenging if you're taking it near 30 reps. But what's important is that you're not afraid to improve, right? Some people will just do the same weight and the same reps for years on end. And I've seen it happen, right? Where I've worked with clients who have been lifting for 10 years, but they're at the level of a beginner because they never pushed, right? So it doesn't matter where you're starting, as long as you're starting somewhere and you're not afraid to progress over time. And that progression doesn't have to always be just heavier weight, right? You can do more repetitions. You can do the same number of repetitions with more control. You can do slightly shorter rest period. You can improve the range of motion, right? At some point, once you improve those factors, you have to add weight. But there are always little areas to progress. And what is important is that you progress over time, and focusing on progression itself rather than the weight that you're using will probably provide the majority of the benefits that come from resistance training.
Yeah, and that's perfect. And that's exactly what I was getting at with that question is, in most cases, you should be starting with low loads or body weight in a lot of cases. But after that no longer becomes challenging, figuring out any number of ways, and you mentioned a number of them, which don't include increasing the weight, to just place that overload stress on the body, as you said earlier, just a little bit more than what the body can handle. You did say something that was interesting and kind of caused my ears to perk up a little bit. You talked about training, close to momentary muscle failure. And I'm wondering how you prescribe your clients with regard to intensity. Are you using percent of 1 rep max? Are you using RPEs? Are you using reps in reserve? How do you grade that progression in intensity?
Sure. I'll touch on that in just a second, but really quick, I wanted to mention that I was thinking when you were saying that for people who perhaps don't have a structured training program, right, and are just going to the gym and doing resistance training, I think a really easy way to know whether an exercise or a set was effective is just ask yourself, could I have done more than another 2 or 3 reps? If the answer is yes, you didn't push that set potentially as hard as you could have, right? Which means that for the next workout, either do 1 or 2 more reps or bump up the weight a little bit. That's a very simple way, right? Regarding my clients, when I start working with a client for resistance training, first off, for online coaching, I do specifically like working with clients who have experience with resistance training. And the reason is because one of the things we were talking about earlier, technique, really hard to teach online, right? I understand there's many benefits to online coaching. There's many limitations as well. And the type of coach you should look to work with if you are looking for one is widely going to vary depending on what your experience is and what you're looking for specifically. So I like working with a population who's been lifting for some time, knows how to lift. Those are my 2 pretty much prerequisites. And I still ask them for video footage on exercises to make sure that they're doing things correctly. But most of the time, and I'm sure you've experienced this, people who have experience with resistance training, if you give them a cue, they know how to implement it. Mm-hmm. Whereas somebody who's new has a really hard time implementing a cue, right? Something as simple as hip hinging, right? It can be really tough for somebody who doesn't have somebody to work with in person. So when I start working with a client, those are my prerequisites. Once we've determined we're a good fit, I usually send them a questionnaire. That questionnaire has some questions on just basic strength, right? What are your favorite types of exercises for these movement patterns? How strong are you at them? And usually when I start with them, the first week is kind of like a test week, not a 1 rep max test week, because most of my clients, like I told you, are not power lifters. Mm-hmm. So usually I ask them to do a 6 to 8 rep max on some sort of compound movement for the upper body, lower body, etc. And then I kind of just progress them from there. When it comes to a general training program, I like starting with a compound movement. That's usually our primary movement. We'll have probably 1 secondary movement that is another compound movement that complements the primary movement, but perhaps not as heavy, right? So primary movement could be a squat. Secondary movement can be a number of things. It can be a lunge. It can be a Bulgarian split squat. It can be a goblet squat, right? They're all going to improve the squat, but they're just not as fatiguing or as heavy as a back squat. And then we'll do some tertiary exercises, which are the isolation-based exercises. Those isolation-based exercises, I pretty much always ask to go near failure. And I kind of just prescribe that as an AMRAP, which stands for as many reps as possible, right? And in the program, I'll say, hey, do 3 sets here at this weight, as many reps as possible. And then if it's within the appropriate rep range, I will taper the weight for the following week based off that. But as far as the primary movement, let's say someone squats, I don't know, 200 pounds for 6 reps. That's their max, right? And then depending on their training experience, and again, this is something I get a better grasp of the longer I work with them, right? Because kind of when I first start with somebody, I don't know what their rate of progress is, right? And like we were talking about earlier, younger people usually progress quicker. But if let's say an example of a 30-year-old man, relatively young, but he's already been lifting consistently for 10 years, compare that to a 50-year-old man who's never lifted. In that case, the 50-year-old man may progress faster than the 30-year-old man, right? So their training experience influences how quickly they can progress. And usually I get a grasp for how quickly they can progress over the first like 6 to 8 weeks of working with them. So when I first start working with somebody, I'm pretty aggressive in terms of my recommendations. And after like 3 or 4 weeks, like, oh man, I can't hit that. And I'm like, okay, I know what your rate of progress is, kind of, right? Mm-hmm. And then that time frame for most people, it's realistically 4 to 6 weeks for like, I don't know, maybe a 5 to 10 pound jump on a particular big compound lift. And so I'll say, okay, our like mesocycle is going to be 6 weeks, more or less. And then I'll program for them over that time period to make sure that on that 6 week, they hit a small personal record, right? It could be 5 more pounds with the same reps, or it could be literally 1 more rep on one of the sets, right? The more experienced you are, the smaller that progress is going to be, right? For myself, in 4 weeks, if I do 4 sets of 8, I'd be happy if in 4 weeks I can do 9 or 10 on that first set. So very, very small progress we're looking for, but progress nonetheless. And that's really how I do it, right? So I'll say, all right, I think you can probably add 5 pounds in 6 weeks. This first week is going to be pretty easy. Still going to be a stimulus, not that hard. If 200 for 6 is the most you can do, maybe here we're doing, I don't know, 160 to 180 for 6 to 8. So significantly below what you're able to do. But we're going to accumulate a lot of volume, because since it's easy, that means you could probably do a good amount of sets there, right? And volume is a primary driver for hypertrophy, muscle growth. And then what I do over that period of time is, some of the isolation stuff, I increase the volume, but on the main lifts, I sometimes keep the volume the same or slightly decrease it and really increase the intensity, meaning the weight they're using. So we might go from that 160 to 170 to 170 to 180. And if 200 for 6 was the best, previously we'd try maybe 200 for 7 or 8, or we'd try 205 for 6. And that's how I like to progress that for pretty much older or younger clients. But it does take some time for me to be able to tell, what's a realistic rate of progress for this person.
Yeah, that's great. That I think that frames up really well what I was getting at there, which is, how do you help this person move towards progress in their workout? And it just shows how nuanced and really complex resistance training program design is. And you absolutely nailed it when you said it depends on the person, because I would almost guarantee there's some people where it is about, they are more motivated by increasing the load, where somebody else might be more motivated by doing a couple more reps. And so there's so many variables to consider. The one thing to just speak on real quick, because obviously even the numbers you mentioned there, 200 for 6 to 8 reps, this is somebody who has a decent strength capability.
Yeah.
How would you start somebody out who's not strength training before? Just so we kind of have that other end of the spectrum. If you could just touch on that real quick, like, hey, this is not somebody who's doing 200 for 6. This is someone who just needs to touch their butt to the chair without plopping. Like, what's your mental model for that?
Oh, okay, of course. So that's more of the population I was working with when I was doing personal training in person, right? And that's the type of person that would greatly benefit from working with somebody in person. Because the first thing we're going to learn is how to do something correctly. So like you mentioned, if the person is not able to squat to 90 degrees, then that's the first thing we're going to work on. And then after that, we're going to work on improving the range of motion further, right? I'm really a big believer, and I think the scientific evidence very clearly shows that you want to train every joint through a full range of motion as much as possible, right? So that's the first thing I'm going to nail down. And most people for squat can nail that down pretty quickly. I'd say a squat's a pretty normal movement pattern. If you look at a baby squat, it's pretty much perfect.
Yeah.
But that would be the first thing I get out of the way, right? And again, good technique is going to look significantly different for different people because of limb lengths. But there's some general things I want to make sure they're doing correctly. Like, let's say we're talking about the squat, right? Little things like keeping the heel on the ground, making sure they're bracing their core, which can be a hard concept to understand. And then dispelling myths like don't ever let your knee go over your toe. That's obviously perfectly fine to do. So just very basic concepts that I want them to nail down. And those things can look really different because you could have a really wide stance, or you could have a very narrow stance, or your feet can be pointing forward or slightly outward. But in general, as long as those things are correct, right? Bar position, you have a good range of motion, your heels are on the floor, you know how to properly breathe and brace. Those are the things I'm trying to get out of the way pretty much right off the bat. Again, those things are really hard to convey over online coaching. So I avoid that pretty much altogether now. But after that, usually a person who is really new to resistance training, once they get the technique down, and honestly, getting the technique down is also going to vary time-wise depending on the person, right? People usually who like have played sports as kids have good coordination and movement through space. They pick things up quickly. There's been times where I've had people who have never lifted learn how to do a squat in one day. There's been times where it's taken like over a month, right? And even then, they still struggle to do it. But usually, that beginning phase of learning how to do something is, I like to think of it as like a latency phase, where like you're not going to see much progress in terms of muscle growth, or perhaps even the weight you're using too much, because the movement is still awkward, right? And this is something that I feel doesn't get emphasized enough, is like learning how to do an exercise is the same as like shooting a free throw for basketball, or doing any skill-based movement for a sport. Doing an exercise correctly is a skill. Does it require strength? Of course, but to do it, body weight requires a minimal level of strength. So people that can't do it body weight, typically it's not a lack of strength. Typically it's they don't have that skill, right? So until they develop that skill, it's kind of like a latency period where I think progress is kind of not that visible, right? There is progress because you're learning how to do something, but it's a hard progress to measure. But once that latency phase is over, once the person knows how to do the exercise, usually that first year, and I'm sure you know this, progress is so quick, right? So I don't even do like a 4 to 6 week cycle for that person. I'm just like, hey, can you hit 5 more pounds this week? Yep. Okay, let's go. And then I just, we're going to ride that for as long as possible. For some people, that's going to be maybe 3 or 4 months. Some people can do that for over a year. And that's going to be determined just by your individual genetics, right? Some people just are really predisposed to building muscle easily, getting strong easily. They can continue to push for a long period of time. Usually they will transition from that beginner phase into like an intermediate phase relatively quickly, right? And I think what we're talking about of doing maybe anywhere from like 150 to 200 pounds for a normal sized adult male is probably like that intermediate phase, I'd say, or beginning of an intermediate phase. And then they can usually maybe progress every 3 weeks or so. So it's not that I guess what I said a little earlier is incorrect. It's not that I don't plan a mesocycle for the person. It's that mesocycle is really short, a week, right? Right? They're going to make progress every week. So pretty much just what I do when I work with a client, and this can be applied at any stage of your resistance training, like complete beginner or very experienced, is you need to determine at what rates can you progress and push that rate, right? Because you want to be able to progress ideally as fast as possible while doing things safely. And if you can progress every week, right? And then once you can't progress every week, I usually transition from weekly progression to 3 weeks, and usually from 3 weeks to 6 weeks. I think you can make progress every 6 weeks for a long time, right? You can be well into being an advanced elite lifter and making small progress every 6 weeks. Like I said, maybe 1 rep on your 4 sets, but nonetheless, you can make progress every 6 weeks. And then perhaps at like very, very elite level, like best in the world type of competitors, maybe that mesocycle looks more like 16 to 20 weeks, where they're looking to improve 1 rep every 4 sets, something like that, after a good amount of training. But I think in general, like people progress really quickly from the 1 week and 3 week cycles to really progressing every 4 to 6 weeks. And then they can, if they have a good training program and are eating sufficiently and resting and really pushing themselves, people can progress every 4 to 6 weeks for a really long time.
That's great. Yeah, you really explained that spectrum so well. Man, Joseph, I think I can just keep asking questions and questions and questions, but I want to be respectful to your time and all of our listeners' time. So before I get to my last question, why don't you tell our listeners where they can find you and more about Team Biolayne? Where are good places to go?
Sure. So if you'd like to learn about us in general, we're very active on Instagram. Honestly, that's probably the platform we're most active on. It's just Team Biolayne. That's Biolayne. So, we post like educational content on social media on a daily basis. Again, like I said earlier, our mission really is to provide evidence-based coaching. So part of evidence-based coaching is to educate the general public. And that's part of our work, right? We post educational material, a lot of really good stuff on the team page. All of the coaches that work as part of Team Biolayne, we also have our individual pages. So you can find me at Dr. So just Dr. Joey Muñoz. That's JoeyMunoz, as in zebra. A lot of people always think I say C for some reason. But I also post a lot of educational content. If you'd like to find out about coaching specifically, you can go to our website, biolayne.com. And if you'd like to see a little bit more of like long form content, we do also post educational videos on YouTube. And that's just Team Biolayne page on YouTube as well.
Cool. And I will link up to all that in the show notes page to make sure everyone has access to it.
Great.
This brings me to our last question, which is the whole basis of this podcast, the wellness paradox, which for me is the lack of interaction between our fitness and our wellness professionals and our medical professionals. And you said it earlier, the best way to live longer is to be stronger to a great extent. Yet the people that can help our aging population get stronger aren't talking to the doctors that are treating them. If you could pick one thing that fitness and wellness professionals could focus on to close off that gap, what would that one thing be?
One thing to close the gap between communication between like medical doctors and fitness professionals.
Yeah, how do we start interacting with each other?
Man, that's a tough question. As much hate as social media gets, I think it's an incredible platform for people to interact. I've met several friends on there who are medical doctors, and they appreciate my work and I appreciate their work, but they're getting some knowledge from me as well that perhaps they didn't get during their medical school, right? So I do think we are moving towards being more integrated. Part of that is thanks to social media. Part of that is also, I really do think like the health and fitness movement is growing like crazy. Really, like we were talking about, you see people who are professionals in other fields like really knowing about resistance training and diet, which is incredible. But I think there's a lack of standard for fitness professionals that I think needs to be something that's discussed more, not just discussed, but I think there needs to be some sort of standard for fitness professionals that's not necessarily there currently. Like I said, I'll use myself as an example. When I was doing personal training before, although I had decent knowledge, I definitely wasn't as credible of a source of information as I am now, right? When I think I was 20 or 21 at the time. What medical doctor is really going to take me serious, right? I'm a fitness professional. Like, they're just going to laugh at me and say I'm a kid, pretty much. So I think there's a standardization that needs to occur. When it comes to nutrition-related advice, there's more standardization there, right? You require a dietitian to give something like a meal plan or something like that, and there's so much to really talk about, because there's also not a lot of communication between like dietitians and medical doctors. And I really don't know what the solution is to make things more integrated. I do know we have to move in that direction, and it does have to be more integrated. There's a number of things that can be implemented that would be beneficial. I think medical students should probably learn a little bit more about nutrition and training, right? Because it's not really a big part of medical school. But at the same time, that's what the nutrition and training professionals are there for. So it's not necessarily the medical doctor's responsibility to know everything, but they should also be okay with referring clients to speak to a professional in the field of nutrition or training. And again, in order to be respected as a professional, I think there has to be some sort of standardization, right? And that doesn't mean like to do personal training, you have to have a master's degree in exercise science or anything like that. But right now there's very little regulation whatsoever, right? Like I can pay for a certificate online, not even take a class, and be a personal trainer, and I can get a job somewhere, which is the unfortunate part, right? I know online coaching is more popular now, but for the longest time, where do people go for personal trainers? Commercial gyms. what type of quality is there at commercial gyms? None, right? In terms of like what you're going to get from a fitness professional there. And the reason why the quality is not so good is because you're going to a gym where you're paying $10 a month and you're paying $20 for personal training from somebody who might be really young, unexperienced, and really you're going to like commercial gyms are pretty much just a business, right? They're trying to make money. So a lot of these places don't hire people who are credible, and overall, the majority of the people working in the field are not so credible or don't have that much knowledge. And unfortunately, our field, I don't want to hate on our field because I love our field. But in general, there's a lot of people who are professionals in our field who don't intentionally give bad information, but they just don't have the knowledge because there's no standardization for our profession, right? So I think that needs to shift first. I think if as a whole, the majority of the profession is a bunch of very educated people who know what they're talking about, who are giving good information, that increases our value, which increases the respect we get from others. That includes physicians, and hopefully that's a good way to make things more integrated and really move towards a medical system that values health or the influence of exercise and diet on health just as much as pharmaceuticals, right? Because I'm also not the type of person that hates on pharmaceuticals. I know a lot of people in that profession do, but if you're educated, you understand how much pharmaceuticals have helped, right? They help incredibly. And it doesn't have to be one or the other. Like you mentioned, it should be an integrated system, right? If somebody has some sort of really bad disease, right? I don't know, let's say late stage diabetes or really bad atherosclerosis or really bad cardiovascular disease, whatever. Yes, they should be on medication. Medication is going to help, but they should also be referred to a professional who's going to teach them how to exercise and how to diet. Yeah, that's my 2 cents. And then whether the person follows up with the exercise or diet is a completely other story. I just think it's a little too easy to just get a pill prescribed and just take a pill. But I think that's the general idea, man. I really think there needs to be more standardization and like a higher standard for people in this field.
I love it. Yes, I could not agree more. Dr. Joseph Muñoz, thank you so much for dropping knowledge today on the Wellness Paradox.
It's my pleasure.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Dr. Muñoz as much as I did. Any information that we'd like to share from this episode can be found on the show notes page by going to wellnessparadoxpod.com/episode 30. Please share this podcast if you found it informative and valuable. And please don't forget to drop us a review on your favorite podcast platform. Those reviews make a massive difference for us. Be on the lookout for next week's episode when it drops on Wednesday. And until we chat again, please be well.